Adventure started at the mailbox. I got an advertising brochure in the mail for a dietary supplement that was supposed to do the most wonderful things. It would give you more energy, it would help you sleep better, and it would prevent and cure a whole array of illnesses, everything from headaches to cancer. Imagine that. It would prevent and cure cancer. Now, you're probably wondering, why don't I know about this, and where can I buy some? But no, I take that back. This is a skeptical audience. You're not going to rush out and buy it. You're going to ask, how could that be true, and where is the evidence? And you're probably wondering what the name of this miracle remedy is. So I'm going to tell you. Are you ready? Wait for it. Ta-da! Vitamin O. Now, when I read that, I was already laughing because everybody knows the vitamins only made it as far down the alphabet as vitamin K. And as I kept reading, I learned that the O stood for oxygen. And if you know what a vitamin is, you know oxygen is not a vitamin. As I kept reading, I found that vitamin O was an oxygen supplement that consisted of oxygen gas in liquid, in water. And now, fish can get their oxygen from the water that they swim in, but fish have gills. Humans don't have gills, and the human digestive tract is not equipped to extract oxygen from the liquids that we ingest. So, as I kept reading, it got sillier and sillier. It turns out that it comes in a little bottle with an eyedropper, and you're supposed to put 4 or 5 drops of this stuff on your food or in your beverage, and it's supposed to raise the oxygen level in your blood. Now, consider the size of a drop. Even if those drops were 100% oxygen, and even if 100% of that oxygen could somehow get into your bloodstream, it would be such a tiny amount compared to what you inhale with every breath that it would be hard to imagine that it could make any difference at all. And of course, there's no reason to think that oxygen, or that increasing oxygen levels in your blood could have all of those wonderful health effects that they were bragging about. And then I found something that really blew my mind. In their advertising, they said that they had had vitamin O tested in an independent laboratory, and the laboratory found that it contained no oxygen. Now think about that. They're selling an oxygen supplement, and they're telling you there's no oxygen in it. But they thought that they could admit that because they thought they could explain it away. You see, there is so much oxygen in vitamin O that the laboratory was unable to measure it. So you see, the laboratory equipment could only measure up to 40 parts per million. Well, it seems to me if it could measure up to 40 parts per million, that it would measure up to 40 parts per million and register as that, not register as 0. So I got to wondering, what universe do these people live in? Now, in my universe, if you take a pitcher of water and try to measure it by pouring it into a glass, you end up with a glass that's full to the brim of water and overflowing. Apparently, in their universe, you can pour the whole pitcher of water into a glass and the glass stays empty and dry. But they thought that they could prove that there was oxygen in it by doing a clinical study. They decided that they could give vitamin O to patients and show that their blood level of oxygen rose, and that would prove that there was really oxygen in vitamin O. Well, no, it wouldn't really. That's circumstantial evidence, and it would be indirect evidence that oxygen was present, but indirect evidence of presence doesn't outweigh direct evidence of absence. So it didn't make sense, but they thought it did. And they went looking for a scientist to do a clinical study. Now, if they approached any legitimate scientist who understood about oxygen and physiology, he probably would have just laughed at them. But they found a medical anthropologist who thought he could do the study. And he decided that he would study anemic patients because he figured, well, anemic patients have low oxygen levels, So it will be easy to show that the oxygen levels rise when we give them vitamin O. Now, he did one thing right. He decided to use this test, the PaO2. That's the pressure of oxygen in arterial blood, which is the gold standard test for the oxygen levels in blood. He did that one thing right. That's the only thing he did right. The PaO2 didn't mean what he thought it meant. It's a measure of how much oxygen gas diffuses across the membranes from the air sacs in the lungs into the blood. And he thought anemic patients had low PaO2s. But there's only two reasons for having a low PaO2 level. One is less oxygen in the air. If you go up to the top of Mount Everest, your PaO2 level will be low. The other reason is some kind of a problem in the lung that impairs the diffusion of the gas across the membranes. Now, anemic patients don't have low PaO2 levels. They have low hemoglobin levels. Now, hemoglobin is the big molecule that gloms onto the little oxygen molecule in the lungs and carries it through the bloodstream and then releases it to the tissues. And their hemoglobin level is low, but their PaO2 level is not low. So if he measured PaO2 levels in these anemic patients, you would expect the before and after measurements to be both normal and to be exactly the same. And then, in a bizarre twist, he decided to do his study in a community of Hutterites. Now, Hutterites are members of an Anabaptist sect who live communally in groups of between 60 to 150 people on collective farms, mainly in the western United States and Canada. And they remain aloof from outside society. They're kind of like the Amish. Why Hutterites? Well, he figured if he did the study in Hutterites, he wouldn't have to use a protocol and he wouldn't have to get informed consent. He could just ask the minister in each community to order all of the people to participate in the study. Well, that's highly unethical because when you do research on human subjects, you have to get approval from an ethics review board to make sure that the patient's rights are protected, that they're not being put in any danger, and that they have the ability to give informed consent and understand what's going to happen to them in the experiment. So this is entirely unethical, and arterial blood tests are risky. It's not like a regular blood test where you draw blood from a vein that you can see. It requires drawing blood from an artery, and they usually do it in the wrist, you know, where you feel your pulse. I learned to do this in medical school, and there's quite an art to it. It's very tricky. You have to feel the pulse with one finger, feel the pulse with another finger, and then imagine where the artery is in between. The artery is buried, it's deep, it's small, it's rubbery. The needle can bounce off the artery, or it can nick it, and there can be bleeding into the tissues. And you can get a hematoma and a blood clot as a consequence of this. It doesn't happen very often, but if it does, it can be devastating because if you don't have collateral circulation on the other side of your wrist, it can cut off the blood supply to your hand, which is not a good thing. So it seems to me that patients enrolling in this study at least ought to know that there's some risk to doing this test and ought to be able to decide whether they want to participate instead of being told by their minister. And there's another problem. The incidence of anemia in the general population is between 1% and 2%. So in Hutterite communities with 60 to 150 people, you would expect to find only 1 or 2 people in each community who were anemic. So he would have had to go to a whole lot of communities to do his study. But he didn't. He found plenty of anemic subjects in just a few communities. And he thought that they would have a low PaO2 level, and by golly, all of the anemic patients he tested had a low PaO2 level. Now, if I had found that, I would have been worried. I would have thought, gee, these anemic people must have some kind of a lung disease. There must be something causing anemia. Maybe they have a genetic disorder, or maybe there's some environmental toxin that they're being exposed to that makes more people in the community have anemia. And Then he found that they all had low PaO2 levels, which they're not supposed to have. Now, if I had found people with a whole community full of people with low PaO2 levels, I would ask, what's causing this? Something's wrong here. But he didn't notice anything was wrong. And by golly, the levels rose after they took vitamin O, just as he would have predicted. Isn't that interesting? There were a lot of other things wrong with this study. The results he got were simply physiologically impossible. He could not possibly have gotten the results that he did. And I'm convinced that he never did any such study. I think he just fabricated the data. He sat in his office and made up the numbers. And it was just totally bogus. It just could not have happened the way he said it happened. And it was the worst example of junk science that I had ever seen, and I complained about it to Wally Sampson, who was the editor-in-chief of the Scientific Review of Alternative Medicine. And he said, there's a lot of junk science like that out there, and nobody takes it seriously enough to pin down what's wrong with it. So he said, why don't you do a formal analysis of the study, and we'll publish it in the journal. So I did, but I hated doing it. Because when you have a problem?
Yeah, just better.
So when you write for a medical journal, you have to be all serious and formal, and you have to use a certain kind of language. There's no snarkiness allowed at all. And I chafed at the restrictions because I thought this whole vitamin O thing was hilarious, and I wanted to make fun of it. So I wrote a funny version of it for the Skeptical Inquirer entitled, "Oxygen is Good Even When It's Not There." And the article was a great success, and it launched my career as a skeptical writer. Now, vitamin O is still for sale, and it even has its own Wikipedia page, which cites my article. And in 2000, the company had to pay a $375,000 fine to settle FTC charges that they made false and unsubstantiated health claims in their advertising for vitamin O. Now here's a statement that I copied from the company's website. I want to read it to you because it's one of the most delicious examples of pseudoscientific nonsense you're ever likely to hear. The whole process involving the creation and stabilization of O2 from normal oxygen, or O1, involves a series of electrical bursts through special metal rods submerged in saline solution over a brief period of time. The electrical force used to rearrange oxygen atoms and knock off sodium and most hydrogen atoms is subjected to an unusual agitation before it ever reaches the saline solution for which it's intended. This agitation introduced into the electrical phase of the process helps to guarantee greater stabilization of the liquid oxygen components by coupling one of them with a single hydrogen atom. Now, the final supercharged oxygen that comes out at the end of these several very different kinds of agitation has lots of O2, some O3, and even a little bit of O4. Each of these is incrementally 30 times stronger, meaning that if O2 is 30 times stronger than O1, then O3 will be 30 times more stronger than O2, and so forth. Now, if any of that makes sense to you, you should be very worried.